The Atlanta Story is a podcast highlighting Atlanta's most interesting creators, entrepreneurs, and builders. I'm Jon Birdsong with Atlanta Ventures, and in today's episode, we have Jim Chasteen and Chad Ralston, the minds and marketers behind American Spirit Whiskey. After fiddling around in college, Jim and his college friend Charlie Thompson decided to take the leap from corporate America and start making their own whiskey. After recruiting a stellar team, including Chad and their head brewer, Justin Manglitz, they began building brick by brick and sip by sip. We talk about the economics of building a whiskey distillery today, how they've marketed their product, and what it feels like winning the Oscars of their industry. We hope you enjoy the show and subscribe to the Atlanta Story. Welcome to the Atlanta Story podcast. We have Jim Chasteen and Chad Ralston of American Spirit Whiskey. Gentlemen, welcome to the Atlanta Story podcast.
Thanks for having us, John.
Hey, John.
We really appreciate y'all's time, particularly in today's environment. Unfortunately, we can't do it in person, but we're excited to learn more about y'all's story and really, this gem of a product and line right in the heart of Atlanta, in the South, and there's so much to discuss today. So excited to learn more. Let's start and kind of back up 2010, whether it was in Charleston or wherever, but talk to us just the origin story of American Spirit Whiskey and why you left your more, I believe on your website, professional jobs.
So really, we didn't leave our professional jobs at first. In 2009, we started kind of toying with the idea of, making whiskey. Charlie Thompson and I were college roommates at Georgia. And we allegedly started making, experimenting on my stovetop, which the law frowns upon. So we got up and running by using a facility in Charleston, right outside of Charleston, South Carolina, to make our first product. And the idea was we had to do something clear. We literally started everything the nerdiest way possible. We bought a book called The Business of Spirits and read it cover to cover and marked it up and came up with this concept that we ultimately were rye whiskey drinkers, Charlie and I, and we wanted to make rye whiskey and build a rye whiskey distillery. But what we found is we had to do something clear to get started. As you can see from the history of most craft distilleries, they almost all start by selling vodka and gin. Charlie and I didn't drink vodka and gin, so we came up with this idea to do a mild white whiskey, which is our first product, American Spirit Whiskey.
Yep.
And then it ultimately got morphed, which a lot of our buddies in marketing told us people were going to abbreviate it, which they did. So they started calling it ASW. And so the original plan was to start with a cash flowing clear spirit. And we wanted to have a name, American Spirit Whiskey, that sounded like you'd heard of it before. And so that ultimately was how we came up with American Spirit Whiskey. And then when we started the distillery, we wanted to come up with a branding strategy that would allow us to kind of create a family of brands. So we started calling the distillery ASW Distillery. We fancy ourselves an incubator of brands. So if you look at all of our brands, they're all brothers and sisters. They're all cousins. And the reason is we won't have an ASW bourbon or an ASW vodka.
Right.
They all have standalone brands, which is what has created in our world the marketing opportunities that Chad has been so masterful at executing, and building these individual brands. So ASW Distillery is the mothership, and it creates brands like our original brand, which was American Spirit Whiskey.
So let's talk about the naming of some of the whiskeys, right? Because Duality, it's phenomenal, right? How do you guys come up with the brainstorming around the names? And it doesn't hurt that they are award-winning product. But walk us through just the naming, because there's so many entrepreneurs that are listening right now are like, oh, I want to go start a company. I want to go start a product, but I need a name. What's the creative process y'all use?
Chad, let me tell the first couple of brand stories and how they happened, and then because it's changed. We kind of knew what the first few brands were going to be called before Chad came on board. We had American Spirit Whiskey. The next product was Fiddler Bourbon. There was a story behind that. We a lot of small craft distilleries start by sourcing product, and instead of being transparent about it, there's an attempt to kind of obscure that. And we didn't want to do that. We were totally fine with sourcing as long as you were transparent with the public about it. And so Fiddler came from that. We did source some wheated bourbon, and then we brought it in house and we fiddled with it. So that's where Fiddler came from. And it didn't hurt that Justin, our head distiller, Justin Manglitz, is an award-winning fiddle player. So that one was a no-brainer.
Sure.
So our current Fiddler Unison, is partially a sourced wheated bourbon and partially a high malt bourbon we made here. So that was Fiddler Unison, two different bourbons together. Duality was with Justin, our backstory was so strong because Justin had been distilling for years. He had 15 years of experience and now 20 when we opened. So that's 15 years of recipes that had already been tried, mistakes that had already been corrected. There is no other 5-year-old distillery in the United States that has that. And that's why we've been able to put as many brands to market as we have successfully. But Duality was a brand that he had been envisioning a long time, and we just came up with a name for it.
What did Justin see in American Spirit Whiskey that made him kind of get galvanized around the opportunity? Right. I mean, this was 5 years ago. So, I mean, y'all had just opened up the tasting room or no, not even yet.
No, Justin and Chad came on board just with the vision that Charlie and I had. So and
what was that vision?
So we had kind of set up like we were going to be big eventually. And so we had created this brand, American Spirit Whiskey, and we'd started becoming successful with it around town. People knew who we were in the restaurant community. The cocktail movement was in full swing. You had H&F, begin that trend. And there was a backlash against vodka at the time. And so we had this clear whiskey that was kind of the anti-vodka, that just the timing was right on it. So we had grown it out of the trunk of our cars to the point where it was big enough that we either had to go big or go home. And Charlie and I both raised money for a living. And so I think the thing that Chad and Justin saw was we had a vision, we had an idea where we wanted to go, and we did have a strategy to finance that vision. And Chad and Charlie are both recovering attorneys. So Chad came on prepare our documents to go raise money. And then Justin was the same thing. He, there's a lot of willy-nilly production that goes on, and there's a lot of very good production that's done pre-legally in the state of Georgia. Justin saw us as an opportunity to bring that out of the shadows. And and I think the plan that we had in place, and the marketing deck that we put together, we just basically, in an awesome private equity community and small investment community in Atlanta, positioned ourselves as the anti-real estate opportunity and the anti-technology opportunity. Not that real estate or technology is negative. It's just different. A lot of that. And we were the opposite of those things.
Well, I want to get into the history of whiskey in the state of Georgia. But before we do that, so many entrepreneurs who are listening right now, they may be that lawyer who wants to go work for his or her own business. Talk to us about how you took the time split from day job to American Spirit Whiskey, and whether it was 40 hours punching the clock, and then after that it was 20 hours building the brand, building the product. Give us some sort of insight of how this turned from a side hustle into a full-time job.
I'll do that on my side. Then I'll hand it off to Chad because he's got an interesting story that came from the technology world. But I was fortunate. I was in a job that was traveling. I was raising money for a real estate company at the time. And I did a lot of events during the day, and I would stay at a hotel at night. And so Charlie and I both worked at night, to build the original brand American Spirit Whiskey. And then we did a lot of weekend, like La Dame de Scaffier event down at the time it was at Serenby. Now it's Fox Hall. But things like that, we'd go and our wives would go and we'd serve people. And we just loved the interaction. I think that was the seed that eventually became the tasting room experience. My wife, Kelly, runs our tasting room experience now. And the ability to, across a table at an event like that, love on somebody and you have a brief second to tell them your story. If you come into our tasting room now, it's the same experience that we began developing at those trade shows, food shows, Taste of Atlanta, Atlanta Food and Wine Festival. That led to the tasting room experience.
Yeah. And Chad, so what did you see in ASW early on that, now fast forward to 6-7 years later, award-winning whiskey, that, back in 2012, 13, and if I'm getting the dates right, where you're like, I want to be part of this movement?
So I was at a software company in Midtown, and I had started to try to develop sales software for craft breweries at the time. And the more and more I talked with, I was doing kind of what you'd call customer discovery before I went out and spent a lot of money trying to develop this with a developer that I had as a partner. And so, talked with some of the big breweries in town, and then just figured I probably needed to have a bigger addressable market. So I reached out to some of the wineries here in the state, and then ended up reaching out to Jim as well. So over a conversation in basically a mop closet, before the distillery was ever built, we just kind of...
It was a nice mop closet.
Yeah.
Nice mop closet. Yep.
We just kind of talked through what this concept was that I had, and then the timing was pretty fortunate because, he, as he mentioned, he and Charlie had kind of reached this decision that they needed to go big or go home. And at first I was a little tentative. So it was really seeing Justin join the team that kind of convinced me that this was probably the appropriate move to kind of, maybe take this concept that I had helping craft breweries hone their sales efforts and bring it in-house with ASW and go from there. And to your point about kind of how you develop these concepts and sort of bring them to life, over the course of a couple of different ideas I've had, it was kind of like, you have your 9 to 5 and then you have your 5 to 9. And so you're putting in work kind of in the wee hours of the night. And then going back to your question about coming up with branding ideas and names, it is, as it's becoming exceedingly difficult to come up with names that aren't already taken. So people are having to get really creative, whether that's in the whiskey space where we're lumped into the same trademark class as breweries and wineries. And there are 8,000 craft wineries and thousands of craft breweries that have already trademarked a lot of the names out there. So it really, the ideation part of coming up with a name, what I've found to be the most successful is, if you have a few people coming up with ideas, writing, generally all one-word names are taken. So if you just need to be writing down single words, and then I like to put them on index cards and then have them out on a floor, and then trying to come up with creative ways to combine those words. And inevitably you end up stumbling on something. And sometimes, something sounds good, but when you find the right name, it just fits. Like at ASW Distillery, we spent 30 to 40 hours coming up with this single malt name, Burns Night. And we'd come up with a lot of ones that sounded pretty good, but I think it was Jim who finally threw out Burns Night, which is a nod to Robert Burns, this Scottish kind of national poet, this annual celebration of his birthday. And what do people do on Burns Night? It's in January every year. They drink single malts. So it was just kind of the perfect name.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And so when you hit on the right thing, you just kind of know it. And we always, just to kind of conclude that thought, we always try to come up with something iconic. I was flipping through a book about Steve Jobs' principles, and one of them was, whatever you do, make it iconic. And so, there are good names out there, and then there are iconic names, and you just got to kind of try to wait until you stumble upon that iconic name.
I love that.
If it's just okay, Chad won't let us do it. I mean, it needs to be something that he can close his eyes. Number one, all of us are happy with. I mean, we do have a little bit of a rule by committee because we do a lot of brainstorming on brands, especially. But, if he closes his eyes and can't see it on a marquee and can't see it really become what we want it to be, and that's every brand, then, all of us have the ability to really put the kibosh on a brand we're not happy with.
So let's dive one more step into that, right? When I drink, Duality, I feel like, I feel like I could be there. There's a lot of versatility there, right? I don't feel like I'm like pigeonholed into, the Maker's Mark, Gentleman Jack, have to be out on a farm drinking it. But I also don't feel like I need to be at, a ultra lounge. And I can see Duality spanning across all of this, right? Because it's a reasonably priced whiskey that is just good, right? What in a world where a lot of people are like, oh, you need to be one thing to one person, I feel like Duality, and hence the name, can be a lot to a lot of people. How did you guys come up with that? And I may be way off here, right?
In terms of the brand name itself?
Yeah, brand name itself, and just the market of who y'all were going after there for, right? I mean, was it the taking from the kind of like Gentleman Jack market, or is it more kind of high end New York club scene?
Jim, you want to start with the name, and we can sort of go into market?
Your question is interesting because it's making me think back to what happened when we did it. Well, so Justin had come up with this concept to do something that was 50% malted rye. And remember, we wanted to be a rye whiskey distillery. So we knew our first brand was going to be 100% malted rye. And that ended up being Resurgence. And Justin had done several experiments on combining malted rye and malted barley. And I'll back into the uses for the product and where it fit into the whole portfolio, but this concept of being 50% rye and 50% barley, it put it halfway between, a distinctive American rye whiskey and, a single malt Scotch, which would be 100% barley malt. And so we were tempted at one point to make it 51% rye, because if we did, it would be a rye whiskey as defined by the beverage alcohol manual,
which is straight bourbon, right? I mean, that's just is.
So bourbon is made from 51% corn. A rye whiskey or a rye malt whiskey in the United States is made from 51% rye or 51% rye malt.
Got it.
And so if we put 1% more rye, it would have been a rye, which would have had a category here. But we came up with this idea somewhere in there to call it Duality, and we loved it. It was good versus evil, rye versus barley malt, the old world versus new world, new versus used cask. And Chad was able to just run with it on the label. And so we knew we had hit on that. If you look at all of Chad's labels have some pretty cool Easter eggs on it. The Duality label was unbelievable. I mean, it's like watching an old cult movie where you find 3 things you didn't remember were there. That's the Duality label, and it just allowed his creativity to run.
Yeah, it's incredible art. It's incredible art.
And then it ended up filling the spot from a marketing standpoint, because we had these people that were coming in, and Americans want a heavy oaked, like a bourbon tasting product. But we had the single malt drinkers that wanted something that was barley malt and had some distinctive grain characteristics like a single malt Scotch would have. And Duality just literally tied those two concepts together and allowed us to go after, that American rye whiskey drinker and that single malt Scotch drinker So Duality Double Malt, and we have seen, there's something called a vatted Scotch, which is if your single malt distillery and my single malt distillery did a blend of just single malts, that's a vatted Scotch. And we have seen at times, if they just do two, people have marketed that as a double malt. But as far as we could find, and still to this day, it's the first time any distillery in the world had ever taken two distinctive malts, rye malt and barley malt. We cooked them together, we fermented them together, we distilled them together, barreled them together, bottled them together, all in one distillery. As far as we know, that has never happened before. And then that was our first submission group to the San Francisco World Spirit Competition. And Duality came back with a double gold, which was the first time, even though Georgia has an incredibly robust spirit making tradition, that was the first time a Georgia whiskey had ever received a double gold from San Francisco, which is our Super Bowl.
Yep. And I want to get to more of that, but Chad, feel free to follow up on the Duality kind of marketplace.
Yeah, I was just going to add briefly that, so, what we realized craft breweries have done so well is they've taken beer and not only created amazing, interesting flavor profiles, but they've added really cool artwork that just kind of almost serves as like a little piece of art in your refrigerator. So we've been trying to take that concept to whiskey, which we haven't seen done so much. And with Duality, given sort of the name of it, we wanted to have this almost like, as Jim mentioned, there are Easter eggs on it. We wanted to have these little secrets, kind of like Skull and Bones Society or whatever. So there are, I don't know that we necessarily had a particular demographic in mind, but at least consciously. But I think probably subconsciously, intuitively, the way the brand ended up the way that it needed to be to appeal to the type of people who would drink it. Like we see a lot of Scotch drinkers and a lot of rye drinkers consuming it. And there are a lot of those folks. New York is a huge market for high-end whiskey. And it's, I don't know if it's so much the lounges as, there are really high-end whiskey bars there. And then closer to home here, we have lots of bourbon and rye whiskey enthusiast groups, along with single malt enthusiast groups that it really caters to, I guess.
And we're going to take a quick break here and share that this podcast is brought to you by Atlanta Ventures. If you are looking to start the next $300 million business out of Atlanta, check out the studio at atlantaventures.com. Let's look at just whiskey in general in the state of America, right? And we've got kind of the Kentucky, Tennessee, and then when you think of Georgia, it's not a Jack Daniel's, right? It's not Maker's Mark. It is. How did y'all find the courage and conviction to say, "Hey, we're gonna plant our flag in the whiskey and bourbon, the whiskey narrative of the overall spirit culture, and we're going to come out and with a great product"? How'd you find that conviction, and then how did you walk us through just the narrative of ASW and how that fits into kind of the whiskey culture of America?
Chad, I'll hit the kind of timing locally, and then if you want to talk about the relationship between the craft movement and smaller brands and the larger brands, that probably would make some sense. But before we met Chad and Justin, we really felt like the timing was right in Georgia. The beer movement had made a lot of progress in Georgia, but was still a little bit behind. Our laws had not caught up. When we raised money, there were only 2 states in the union where you couldn't buy direct from breweries and distilleries in the state. And we knew Mississippi was about to change their laws. So we just felt like the timing was good. They had snuck in a little piece of legislation that did allow you to taste on site. You still couldn't buy in an ag bill about somewhere in the 2005 to 2008 range. And so the bones were there, and we'd made a lot of progress on wine with the farm winery license in Georgia. So our demographics are awesome in the state of Georgia. I mean, think about, literally 80 to 85% of the alcohol consumed in the state of Georgia is within an hour and a half of Atlanta. Then you've got you've got Savannah and a few other outliers, but it's just such a concentrated coverage. And so you think about what happened with North Carolina, you would have to cover from Asheville to Wilmington. But in Georgia, you had this, concentration because of the city of Atlanta. So we knew, unless you just got on the wine trail, then Atlanta was the perfect place to do it. Old Fourth was pioneering, and we were watching them and friends with them very closely. And, people kind of try to pit us against each other sometimes, but we were all talking. We're all, there are not that many distilleries. We're all very good friends. So, and what we knew about Atlanta, we always joke is, it's a small town that just happens to have a lot of people in it. And so the word of mouth and the ability to support, across demographics in this town, across age, across neighborhoods, when you look at what Atlanta did to embrace its breweries, we felt like the opportunity was ripe. And we have more, distillery history in the state than we had brewery history. I mean, like when people are so nostalgic about the 40 Fords running from the revenuers, that was happening on Piedmont when it was a dirt road. And 50 years ago was it was still happening even in more modern times. So Georgia was the right place to do it from a demographic standpoint and from a timing standpoint. And then when we met Justin and we met Chad, then we knew it was the right place from a team standpoint as well.
Yeah, and within a larger sort of American craft movement, you had wineries kind of started maybe back in, you'd call it maybe the 70s, like particularly when a Napa Valley cab was, rated ahead of a lot of French wines. And then the first craft brewery wave was kind of in the 90s. And then obviously in the last 10, 15 years, we've seen the second wave of craft breweries. And distilleries were kind of late to the game. And I think in large part, that's because distilleries, they require a lot of capital up front just to get your distillation equipment. But also, if you're, especially whiskey making, you're looking at a really intensive time commitment. Even if you're putting whiskey into smaller barrels, so your standard barrel is 53 gallons, and you can sort of mature whiskey a little more quickly if you put it into smaller barrels because you have more wood for every molecule of whiskey. So even using quarter casks or 15-gallon barrels, you're still looking at a couple of years before you can bring a product to market oftentimes. So, I think craft whiskey was a little slower to catch on for those reasons, and probably others I'm not really thinking of. And so because of that, particularly in the South, we realized, you had some California distilleries and some Northeast distilleries doing this very thing. So to Jim's point, it really did seem like the time was right.
I think one of the things too, to play off the big brands, a lot of these small brands that we buy at the package store that we think are craft are actually owned by, there are 8 distilleries own the vast majority of the American craft bourbon and rye brands. And so people looked at those as, hey, we already have these small brands. Well, they really weren't. And they weren't using the same recipes that brand was using, back when the very large syndicate bought them. But those big companies have done an excellent job of kind of revitalizing these tiny brands and marketing around them. And so there was a perception that, well, that already exists. But it wasn't. It was the big guys producing these, just using these little throwback brands. And so we've had a lot of education. And until in Georgia, you could do the tasting room where I'm sitting there talking to somebody and explaining this to them, that was quite an uphill battle.
Makes total sense. And so let's talk about some of that recipe and secret sauce to win the Super Bowl of spirits for y'all, which is the San Francisco World Spirit Competition. And what is the secret sauce, without revealing too much, of ASW's taste and feel? And I know you mentioned a little bit earlier of the 50-50 on the Duality front, but just give us a little bit of insight on the secret sauce that makes a winning Super Bowl team.
Chad, why don't you take this one? Because there's a lot of strategy to what we submit and how we submit it. But ultimately, that competition is a blind competition. So it gives the little guys an opportunity to compete. Nobody's looking at a bottle that they have seen a million times before. It's purely just something in a glass that the judges, I have as much of a chance as the biggest brand you could name has sitting in a glass.
Love that.
The secret sauce would be 2 words: Justin Manglitz. That is our master distiller. He, as Jim mentioned, he now has over 20 years experience, and we're fortunate he's self-taught. And so that means that he has taken a pretty novel approach to whiskey making, that if he had been an apprentice at one of the large facilities, either in Kentucky or across the pond in Scotland, he might not have had quite as of an outside the box approach to things. So he basically took so you have 2 types of stills in the world. You have column stills, which you'll see here in the South, that make a lot of the bourbon that you drink, and then you've got pot stills that make all the single malt Scotch that you've ever drunk. And so he took the Scottish style pot still setup, but he combined it with something that we do here pretty much only in the South, which is leaving our grain solids in throughout the whole process. So in Scotland, when you're making a single malt, you're sifting your grain solids out after you cook them. Here, Justin's leaving our grain solids in, like they do in bourbon country, all the way into the stills. So kind of like the way you leave a tea bag in the water longer and it extracts more of the flavor. Same thing is going on with Justin's extraction of flavor from these grains. So that hybrid approach, using Scottish style stills with American style grain in distillation, leads to really not only flavorful whiskeys, but an interesting texture almost. Like a lot of column still distilled whiskeys are a little thinner. If you drink Duality, like I know you've had recently, it's gotten me through COVID. Yeah, exactly. It has a little bit more of a chewy character or like a thicker character. It's hard to describe, but that has all led to how we approach San Francisco World Spirits Competition, which is there are lots of different categories. So we always and there are usually one to 3 categories you could submit a spirit in. And so we try to find the category where we think that particular style is going to resonate the most. And then we've also found that, what was I going to say? Oh yeah, we've also found that cask strength does especially well there. So in terms of how we approach the competition, it's just making sure you get the right spirit into the right category. And even though Duality at 88 proof, which is not cask strength, it won Georgia's first ever double gold medal there. We found that cask strength, the judges seem to especially appreciate, I guess, the more intense flavors.
Yeah, and so we went back and looked, and Chad will have to correct me on this one, but over the last 3 years that we've been submitting to San Francisco, we're the second most awarded distillery, craft distillery in the competition. So, this past year we came home with 2 more double gold awards. One for, to Chad's point, our Resurgence. We have a cult following around Resurgence cask strength. So every now and then we do a cask strength release, and it's the same people that just buy it. And so we submitted that to San Francisco, even though it was limited, it was ongoing, and we won a double gold with that. And then our single malts have done very well. To Chad's point, usually we enter our spirits, or a lot of times we enter in the craft category. But last year we started entering in the other single malt categories, so not Scotch. And Burns Night won a gold, a gold medal, for a single malt out of Atlanta, Georgia, was unbelievable. This year we submitted our single malt Maris Otter, which is all part of our Americanic series, and it won a double gold and best in class. So the same week that the world fell apart, this tiny little distillery out of Atlanta, Georgia, wins the best craft distilled whiskey in the world, according to the San Francisco World Spirit Competition.
I feel like that should be on the front page of the AJC.
I know, right?
It was just, the timing was bad. It's a terrible analogy, but it's like nobody remembers. I'm going to actually skip the story.
Sure. Yeah. Well, let me ask you a culture question, right? Because how do y'all provide that creative flexibility to the team, right? Justin, without being like, you hear people say, stay in your lane, right? And where like a bigger organization, Justin or any artist would sit there and just have to, write this type of copy or, do this type of work. But talk to us about the culture of experimentation that y'all have fostered at ASW. It seems to be working.
I think it comes down to trust. In the beginning, we were all involved in everything, and we were all creative, but we were all independent, and we were all sensitive, which is interesting. So when we're bouncing our opinions around, Charlie is the exception to that, but the rest of us are really, we hold on to our opinions and we're sensitive. So we had to evolve in a way that we all work together. And eventually there became this trust where if Justin said, let me give this a try, none of us are going to push back on that. We trust him even before we started winning the awards, because at the end of the day, we are all whiskey drinkers and we liked what he was producing even before the outside world started noticing it. So there became a trust there. And then with Chad too, I mean, it was hey, this isn't going to work. Not to say he wouldn't explain it, because he does a good job of, hey, here's why marketing wise, we don't need to go down this road. But there's a trust factor there that evolved, but it wasn't there day one. I think we liked each other, but now we trust each other.
Let's talk about some of the marketing on the consumer side, right? I mean, here's a direct to consumer brand right out of Atlanta. We do have good bones, doing that, especially on the beverage side with Coca-Cola. But when you look at ASW's marketing, right? I mean, Chad, you've got this amazing newsletter that's funny, clever, and informative. But there's also certain things where y'all have decided, obviously, not to invest in, right? Like, for example, and I don't know if I was looking at the right Instagram account, but the American Spirit Whiskey Instagram account, I think the last one was 2013. Like, look, it seems like y'all have y'all's marketing philosophy is speak softly and carry a big stick. That big stick being award-winning whiskey. Tell us, just give us a little taste of what makes a y'all's marketing strategy something that's working besides a great product.
Yeah, I mean, we early on, I think all came to kind of a collective decision that the most powerful marketing out there is word of mouth. And so just about everything that we have done is to try to optimize that. And then, as we've grown and started to develop more of a budget for some of the more high profile things that you might see around town, like a billboard or advertising on 680 The Fan. As we've developed more of a budget for that, we've been strategic in doing some of those things, but it really is first and foremost word of mouth. And a lot of that, as Jim could speak to probably even more robustly, is the tasting room itself is just a huge opportunity to get to connect with people and to share with them our experience in getting to where we are. And I mean, it's just such a genuine, authentic story of how we got there, coupled with fantastic product. I mean, if the whiskey wasn't good, we wouldn't be where we are. And if the authentic, the authenticity and sort of the word of mouth flywheel that we've created weren't where they are, we wouldn't be here today either. So it's been kind of a tandem on that front.
So let's talk about where y'all are, right? I mean, Jim, you mentioned you raised money in 2015, 2016. Is that right?
Yes.
Built the distillery. Can you share how much you raised? I mean, how much does it cost to kind of break into this market from a nuts and bolts figure?
So we did a lot of research. We traveled around the country looking at craft distilleries and talking to craft distillery owners. And there are, 5 years earlier, there wouldn't have been any blogs or, online presence to learn from. But now there are the American Craft Spirits Association and American Distillers Institute, ADI, which is distilling.com, have forums now where you can see. It's mostly terrible stuff, unfortunately, when you read a forum, but there are issues that you're dealing with. And so it allowed us to, kind of structure and know what we needed. And what we found, we wanted to avoid landmines. That's been one of we try to raise money based on risk management. And the landmines that we kept hearing about is, I didn't raise enough money. I didn't have enough space. And we just knew we didn't want to do those things. And I didn't get enough equipment. Those three things were the landmines that we wanted to avoid. So we raised just under $2 million from our closest friends and not family. And then went out and did that. And we were all cash at the time too. So that was another, a lot of the technology startups that we were seeing at the time were a little more leveraged, and ours was not. So at the end of the day, we were just this old school manufacturing fundraiser. It was around a cool concept, but it was just buying equipment, building inventory. And if the world fell apart, inventory and the equipment would be worth something.
Right.
Unlike leveraged real estate and unlike some of the technology fundraisers that we were watching at the time, real time. We have a lot of technology investors that are now our investors, which is interesting.
Sure.
And so I think that was it. We figured out what landmines to avoid, and we raised enough money to avoid those landmines. If I had to do it again, probably would have raised more. With the crisis now, I mean, we've kept a lot of cash on our balance sheet, but the last downturn was really kind of a credit, a debt issue. I think this time people were wanting to hold on to cash. So, to survive, we had never, had a line of credit before. So, we were in a scramble when the COVID crisis hit that, we'd never borrowed any money. So, I mean, we would have been in better shape had we had an extensive history of debt, which was really interesting for us to overcome at the time. But we had a banking relationship that worked out well.
Yeah. So talk to us about the effects of COVID on just bottles out, but also the touring side of ASW, right? Because that's a whole nother revenue stream.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about that for a whole podcast, honestly, but to break it down simply, our revenue is divided into 4 quarters, and 3 of them completely disappeared. We lost tasting, we lost restaurants, and we lost private events. Those 3 things, that's 75% of our revenue that was gone. Now, a lot of our peers, obviously, we were very close friends with restaurants, so they were in trouble and we were in trouble, but we did still have that 25% that was going through the package stores, and that didn't drop off. And then in a few weeks, we realized it was actually going up. And that was interesting. We thought we were doing well until Discus, which is kind of the trade industry for mostly the larger distilleries, showed that the big distilleries were up by like 40% with people staying home and buying bottles. Well, the craft guys were just not up that much. We were up, but not enough, not anywhere close to the big brands. And what we figured out was, if you're walking into a store and you don't want to stick around that long, you just go with what you know. So if somebody wanted bourbon, they would grab a big national brand, probably a 175, a big portion, and leave as fast as possible. We live and die by people shopping and trying new things. And so while we did see an increase, it wasn't enough to really make a huge difference on that 25% growing, and nowhere near what the big guys got. So as people are listening to this, I will say, please try to support your local breweries, wineries, and distilleries during this time, because that quarter of our revenue is not being replaced yet by the increase in demand at the package stores, because the big guys are getting most of it.
Yeah.
The flip side to that was limited release products. And so Chad and our marketing, our sales team, man, they just went crazy on barrel picks. And so a lot of the bottle shops in Georgia have gotten very creative. I'll point to Bridge Patel at Sprayberry Bottle Shop, has a huge online presence, and began to start doing barrel picks with us. So we started doing Georgia Heartwood. We did a Duality barrel pick. We started doing single malt barrel picks, and they were going to these stores. And then all of a sudden it became an online presence, and people then walked into the store to buy that thing. So while it certainly hasn't been enough to make up the 75% of our revenue that we lost, these specialty releases have allowed us to tread some water and create a lot of brand, like Chad was talking about, word of mouth. I mean, the same people that get online and that has allowed some momentum along with the online presence to really make up a little ground.
Sure. And that's helpful. And is the touring business coming back? Because I see that you can book time on y'all's website to take a tour. Walk us through kind of some of the touring business side of ASW that's coming out of COVID as restrictions are a little bit more lenient.
Chad, I'll let you take that one, and then I do want to talk about the other survival which we had, which was the hand sanitizer opportunity.
Yeah. So prior to March, our tours and tastings were every Thursday, Friday, and Saturday here at the distillery and at the exchange in the West End, where we house most of our barrels. We had more extensive tour and tasting hours, but it was pretty much show up and have a sample or two, and then take a tour whenever we felt like there was a group that was big enough and of enough demand to take them back through the production facility. We have obviously in today's environment we have to be a little more sort of rigid and have guidelines around how we're doing things. So we have gone to a reservation only model, and we have specific tour times throughout the day. It's only on Saturdays right now at the original facility on Armour Drive. But that has been, we've had it for 2 weekends now, and it has been doing pretty well. As Jim mentioned earlier in the podcast, it's allowed us to, the groups are smaller, so we have more one-on-one interaction with people on the tour, but it's also been a way to kind of help manage the flow a little better of people in and people out.
Beautiful.
And our our spend per head, one of the things that has been different about the distilleries almost universally compared to the breweries is people do the tours. I mean, most people at this point don't go to breweries and do a tour. 90% of our guests want a tour at the distillery. And our spend per head is 3 or more times higher than a brewery. So we have less people coming in the door, but people buy bottles. They keep longer. They people can put them in the car and take them to a friend. They gift better. So that has held true during the last 2 weekends, and we just get a bigger spend per head.
I love that. I mean, it's the tasting is such a way to share the story, and it's such a great story that to Chad's point, that word of mouth is so much more real than anything else. And it's like every day with the tours, you have these people who spread the word. I mean, it's just a great strategy. A lot of companies should do that. All right, y'all. I mean, every time I swear we always say 30 minutes and we're coming up on 50 now. It's unbelievable. And I feel like we could talk about so much more, but we need to wrap it up. Talk to us about Atlanta. Why Atlanta? What has Atlanta done for y'all? Chad, obviously, I know you're an Atlanta native and have been here for quite some time. Jim, you're a UGA grad, but share why Atlanta and what Atlanta's done for y'all.
I think the best, most real world example I can give right now is the COVID crisis. A lot of I think I would put distilleries as being probably the most surprisingly beneficial businesses to have in the old neighborhood. Nobody really realized about the challenge with hand sanitizer, being able to obtain it when the world fell apart. And here we are as a group of companies that make ethanol, which can be used as a primary ingredient in hand sanitizer. So the Georgia distilleries and the craft distilleries around the country really started. It's not like we were our grandparents, learning how to make tanks instead of Fords, but we also did have this ability to meet a demand in the community. And I think really put a lot of effort into switching over production to do that. It was especially hard for those of us that are whiskey distilleries. We're going to have a vodka and gin distillery up and running here pretty soon at the Battery outside of the Brave Stadium. But our whiskey distillery needed a lot of work to meet the hand sanitizer demand. And I found it to be a very uniquely Atlanta story. The way ours worked is Cox Enterprises called us and said, "Hey, we're a big company, but we're a utility provider, and we're going into people's houses and have no way to wash our hands or whatever." And they asked us if we could make it. I had a relationship with Dane Dickey from Cox through church. Our wives knew each other through a friend named Sarah Sullivan, and she made the introduction, and we were able to work with them. And we said, "Man, we are in a cash crunch right now." And they said, "Don't worry about it. We will prepay for our first order." And I said, "Well, if you are willing to pay, X amount per gallon, then we can get in business. And at the same time, once we get up and running, we can actually donate." At the time, which the plan was to do about a half gallon for every gallon they bought, but eventually we were able to get close to a gallon for every gallon that they bought. And Cox, this giant, company, was able to find a neighbor, ASW, down the road and solve this issue that they had. And at the same time, it allowed us to we've donated to over 50 charities during that time. Cox, the initial purchase along with other local companies allowed us to make huge donations. We gave away, we're right at 1,000 gallons of hand sanitizer we were able to donate to Children's Healthcare, Boys and Girls Club. Most of the hospital. We had times where we had nurses calling directly and saying, "I've got nothing in the emergency room." And there was one day my daughter and I hopped in the truck and we're like, "We'll get it there to you." We dropped off gallons to, nurses in the emergency room drive-through. So, Atlanta allowed that to happen. I mean, where do you have this kind of this, mashup of Fortune 500, budget calling a tiny company that they could help, but they could also help them solve a community problem. And it was awesome. I mean, it was awesome. It was a war room. Nobody could find bottles. Nobody could find the other ingredients to sanitizer. And so my wife, Kelly, and I were sitting back to back in chairs, just making calls and trying to, source all these ingredients. And if it wasn't such a dire situation, now that we're, have at least gotten through that, we can look back and say that was amazing how all of it came together. And it came together in a uniquely Atlanta way.
Remarkable. And
just to provide context on that 1,000-gallon donation, that would be about the equivalent of like 60,000 Purell bottles. Those little Purells, So yeah, Jim and Kelly were really instrumental in that, not only contributing to all those nonprofits, but also that was a big chunk of revenue that really helped defray some of the challenges of losing those 3 different sectors of sales that Jim was talking about earlier.
And Chad, what about you? Atlanta? Why Atlanta?
Yeah, I mean, it is really, really awesome. The last, I don't know how many releases, the limited releases we've been coming out with have been selling out really, really quickly. And that is just a testament to how supportive the Metro Atlanta community. And I think we've had people come in from as far as Athens and even a little farther to pick up these limited releases. So, I mean, just a huge thanks to the Atlanta community for being supportive of their local kind of makers.
Yep. Awesome. Well, Jim, Chad, thank you both for being part of the Atlanta Story podcast. We really appreciate y'all and the time you spent sharing ASW story and all the fascinating lessons and learnings. And we look forward to seeing what the next decade has in store for y'all, because I know it's going to be big.
Thanks for having us, John.
Thanks, John.
This podcast is brought to you by Atlanta Ventures. It was co-produced by JC Lucas and Jon Birdsong. If you are looking to start the next $300 million business in Atlanta, check out the studio at atlantaventures.com and the companies we work with who've done it before. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it at your next coffee meeting or dinner greeting, rate it, and write a benevolent, eloquent review.